Hello and welcome. These audio recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam, and we'll go over some of the more common Part C questions found on Paper 1, each of which is worth 10 marks. You might find it useful while listening to have a pen and paper to hand, or it's okay just to listen through as part of your revision. Today we will be looking at a very popular question that comes up on the paper invariably in a number of formats, but the content required to answer it is quite similar. How successful was the League of Nations? Now, when answering this question, you need to bear in mind that Part C answers will always give you a statement followed by the question, how far do you agree? So this question could come up in terms of the League was a success in some ways but not in others, how far do you agree? Or the League was mostly a success in social issues, how far do you agree, etc. You need to rely on a good essay writing technique to help you answer this question effectively. Also, be aware of the dates given in the question, as often the question will just focus on the 1920s or just focus on the 1930s, and if you include information from both periods, you might not be credited marks for half of what you write. But in the interest of covering all bases, this question and answer session will focus on a generic how successful was the League of Nations format. It's up to you to take out what you need for the question set. As with all of these audio recordings for Paper 1 Part C questions, we will break it down into PEEs. In other words, individual paragraphs that give a point, support that point with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, and then explain. In your answers, you should try and explain in two ways and use connectives such as because, this shows, this suggests to help you achieve this. This will give you multiple layers of analysis and will help you hit the higher marks. We call this PEE 2.0 because you're doing it twice. It's crucial for this type of answer to give a yes and no type response. In other words, to give two sides of the argument. And so in breaking this question down, we will give 3 points or PEs that support the question that the League was a success, and we'll focus on the 1920s for that. We'll then give a further 3 points or PEs that suggest the League was not a success, and we'll focus on the 1930s for that. So in total, it's a 6-point scope. Okay, let's get started. How successful was the League of Nations? Let's start by arguing that it was a success in the 1920s. Point 1. Territorial disputes. Evidence that supports that the League was a success in the 1920s in terms of territorial disputes include the following. In Vilna in 1920, the League did nothing to prevent Polish aggression. And in Corfu in 1923, Mussolini had boasted and forced the Greeks to pay compensation. However, there were some successes. For example, in the German-Polish dispute over Upper Silesia in 1921, and also in the Swedish-Finnish dispute over the Åland Islands in 1921. Our final piece of evidence to support this is that the Greeks obeyed when they were asked to leave Bulgaria in 1925. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that the League did have some territorial successes in terms of disputes in the 1920s. Point 2. Social issues. Social issues are one of the really big successes of the League of Nations, which, remember, was Woodrow Wilson's 14th point in his famous 14 points. Evidence to support this claim could include the following. 400,000 prisoners were returned or repatriated. There was a crisis in Turkey in 1922, which left 100,000 refugees who the League helped to house. Moreover, the League set up the International Labour Organization, known as the ILO, and this organization achieved a number of things, including the banning of the use of white lead, limiting child labour hours, raising worker conditions, introducing a 48-hour week and an 8-hour day for some of its members. The League also had successes in social issues in the 20s through the setting up of the World Health Organization, or WHO. The WHO defeated leprosy, fought malaria, and also fought against yellow fever. Moreover, the League dealt with international social problems. It blacklisted firms who were known to be involved in drugs. And it also helped free 200,000 slaves in British Sierra Leone. The League fought slave traders in Myanmar and reduced the death rate on the Tanganyika Railway from 50% to 4%, as well as working on drug trafficking and prostitution. And so in explaining this point and linking it back to the question, there is plenty of evidence that suggests the League was a success in terms of social issues. Point 3. Disarmament. Evidence to suggest the League had some successes in reducing the number of weapons there were in the world include the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, in which America, Britain, France and Japan all agreed to reduce the size of their navies. But it was also involved in the Rapallo Treaty of 1922, where the Soviet Union and Germany began talks, and perhaps most famously at Locarno in October 1925. Locarno fostered a positive spirit and was attended by France, Britain, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Poland and Czechoslovakia. And as part of the agreement, Germany agreed to go along with the western borders created at Versailles, although it did leave an open question about future negotiation over its eastern borders. The League was also involved in the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, also known as the Pact of Paris. In this pact, it was agreed that members would not use force to settle disputes. And finally, the League was involved in both the Dawes and Young plans of 1924 and 1929, which helped ease the pain of German reparation payments. And so there is a multitude of evidence when explaining the point that suggests the League was successful in a number of international agreements, notably those focusing on disarmament. Okay, so having argued that the League was a success in some ways, particularly in the 1920s in terms of territorial disputes, social issues and disarmament, we're now going to use the magic words. On the other hand. And we're going to start looking at a 3-point scope that suggests the League was not a success, particularly in the 1930s. Point 1. Manchuria. Evidence to support this point includes the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was triggered by the Mukden incident on the South Manchuria Railway. The Depression hit Japan and she wanted an empire, and as such invaded Chinese Manchuria and set up a state called Manchu Kuo in February 1932, before beginning bombing Shanghai. The League report dealing with this took a whole year to come through, eventually blaming Japan. The League vote had a ratio of 42-1, the one vote against being Japan, who decided to then leave the League on the 27th of March 1933. But the League did very little about this Japanese aggression. There were no economic sanctions because the USA, the international economic powerhouse, was not a member. Moreover, there were no military sanctions taken because the League didn't have its own army and Britain and France weren't that interested in getting involved. There is a famous David Lowe cartoon which you may have seen, illustrating Japan using the League as a doormat in 1933. And this was a crucial turning point because it was the first instance where a large nation decided to walk all over the League. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that Manchuria was an example of how the League was not a success in many ways. Point 2. Abyssinia. Evidence to support this point includes Mussolini invaded Abyssinia in 1935, and this was, many argue, the fatal blow to the League. This was a European country with borders to France attacking a country which bordered British interests in Egypt and the Sudan. And it was on the League's doorstep, unlike Manchuria, which was much further away, so it's often seen as the acid test of the League of Nations. Abyssinia's leader, Haile Selassie, appealed for help to the League after a dispute at Wal Wal. The League of Nations played for time and signed the Stresa Pact, giving promises over Germany with Italy. But Abyssinia was not even discussed, and Mussolini saw this as the League turning a blind eye, and so he continued to launch a full-scale attack in October 1935. Economic sanctions were not fully applied because of a fear that this would lead to 30,000 miners' jobs being lost in the UK. Also, Britain did not close the Suez Canal to Italian troops, which it could quite easily have done. A British-French agreement in September 1935, called the Hall-Laval Pact, proposed giving Italy 2/3 of Abyssinia in return for calling off the attack, and historian J.R. Weston says this was, quote, fatal to the League, unquote. And historian T.A. Morris calls it irreversible damage. A.J.P. Taylor called it, quote, the real death of the League, unquote. And historians therefore often cite this as the key turning point. In May 1936, the Abyssinian capital, Addis Ababa, fell, and Anthony Eden said the League had left, quote, no confidence, unquote. Soon after, Hitler marched into the Rhineland in March 1936, and shortly after signed the Berlin-Rome Axis. And so in explaining Abyssinia, you may wish to argue that this was the acid test of the League and that it failed, and thus linking back to the question, the League was not a success. Finally, point 3, disarmament. Evidence to support this point includes a conference was held in February 1932, and it agreed on principles but little action. For example, It agreed that the bombing of civilians should be outlawed, but the means of doing this, i.e. building bombing aircraft, was not banned. Hitler therefore began secretly rearming in February 1933. And in 1935, Britain unilaterally signed a naval agreement allowing the German Navy to stay within 35% of the size of the British. This was in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles, but the League did nothing about it. So in explaining this final point, you may wish to argue that the League of Nations was unsuccessful in terms of disarmament in the 1930s, and that it was in effect a toothless tiger. Okay, so in answering the question how successful was the League of Nations, we have given a 3-3 split, arguing that it was a success, particularly in the 20s, in terms of some territorial disputes, social issues, and disarmament. However, we've given a counter-argument that it was not a success in many ways, especially in the 1930s, in terms of Manchuria, Abyssinia, and disarmament. Okay, now it's time for our clever conclusion. The League certainly did have some successes in the 1920s, but it had many failures which showed up in a very dangerous period that was the 1930s. The League of Nations was a new concept, and it was entering uncharted territory, so perhaps we shouldn't be too harsh on it for that reason. It was a noble experiment, but many would argue it was doomed from birth due to missing important nations, the lack of an army, and several structural problems, notably the veto. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or you can subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.